You're standing in the Forum Romanum on a morning in 114 BC, and the silence is wrong. Rome is never silent. But today, as a covered litter passes through the crowd, no one speaks, no one whispers. The litter moves like a funeral procession, except the woman inside isn't dead yet. She's wearing white robes beneath the covering, the sacred garments she's worn for 15 years. Her name is Amelia, and she's being carried to a place where a small room has been prepared underground. Inside that room, a bed, a lamp, a loaf of bread, water, milk, just enough provisions for the Romans to claim they aren't murderers. Then the earth will be heaped over the entrance, and Amelia will be left alone in the darkness, with the gods as her only judges. The crowd parts without a sound, because everyone knows what's happening, and no one can stop it. Before we go further into this, I'm genuinely curious where. Are you watching this from it? It still amazes me that a story this dark, this complex, from over 2,000 years ago, can reach people across the entire world. There's something about the human stories buried in history that connects us all. This is Rome in the early 1st century BC, a republic straining under the weight of its own expansion. Wars with Germanic tribes are bleeding the legions dry. Social tensions between Rome and its Italian allies are reaching a breaking point. Political factions are circling each other like wolves. And then a young woman, daughter of a Roman knight, is struck by lightning and killed. In Roman belief, lightning isn't random, it's Jupiter's fury made visible. Something has contaminated the city's relationship with the gods. The haruspices priests who read omens in animal entrails and celestial signs. Consult their ancient books and deliver their verdict. Examine the Vestals. The sacred priestesses who guard Rome's eternal flame must be investigated, because when Rome suffers, when the gods withdraw their favor, the fault must lie with those who mediate between heaven and earth. What the haruspices set in motion that year would end with 3 women buried alive and several men beaten to death in the Forum. But here's what makes this story more than just ancient cruelty. Amelia wasn't some powerless victim. Until the day of her trial, she had been one of the most powerful people in Roman or woman. She could own property without a male guardian. She could make her own will. Condemned criminals were pardoned simply by accidentally crossing her path. She had legal rights that senators' wives could never dream of. And now she was being sealed underground to suffocate in the dark. To understand what happened to Amelia, you need to understand what a Vestal Virgin actually was, and I promise it's nothing like what you've been told. The order stretched back into the mists of Rome's founding, established by King Numa Pompilius in the 8th or 7th century BC. Always 6 priestesses, never more, never less. Their sole duty, maintained the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The fire could never go out. This wasn't superstition to the Romans. This was physics. This was causation. The eternal flame represented Rome's life force. If it died, Rome would fall. The city's survival, its armies, its territories, its very existence depended on 6 women keeping one fire burning year after year, generation after generation. But you couldn't be just anyone. The selection requirements reveal everything about what Romans believed about purity in female bodies. Age between 6 and 10 years old. Not younger, not older. Prepubescent, physically intact, representing the perfect state before womanhood began. Family, originally only patrician bloodlines, Rome's ancient aristocracy. Your parents had to be alive, married to each other, living respectably. You couldn't have physical or mental defects. You had to be, in Roman eyes, absolutely perfect. The selection was called captio, taking or capture. 20 candidates presented to the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. He would choose one, and the moment she was selected, something extraordinary happened. The girl was legally freed from patria potestas, the father's power that governed every other Roman woman's entire existence. She didn't pass from her father's control to her husband's control, as every other woman did. She became something unprecedented in Roman law. The ceremony was carefully scripted. The Pontifex Maximus took her hand and spoke the ancient formula. "I take you, Amata, to be a Vestal priestess. To perform the rites which it is lawful for a Vestal priestess to perform on behalf of the Roman people, Amata, beloved." Every Vestal was called Amata at her induction, regardless of her birth name. It was the first step in creating a new identity, separate from family, belonging only to Vesta. Her hair was styled in the semi-crinsix braids wound around her head, a style otherwise worn only by brides on their wedding day. This wasn't coincidence. A Vestal occupied the liminal space that other Roman women passed through quickly, the transition from daughter to wife, but a Vestal stayed there forever, suspended between girlhood and womanhood, between family and family, belonging nowhere and everywhere at once. Here's what the romantic versions never tell you. Families didn't volunteer their daughters out of piety. Suetonius records that in Augustus' time, aristocratic families used their influence desperately to keep daughters from being selected. Augustus himself claimed he would have offered his own granddaughter if she'd been the right age, trying to shame reluctant nobles into cooperation. Why the resistance? Because once selected, a girl was gone, not dead, but gone. 30 years in the house of the Vestals, 10 years learning, 10 years performing duties, 10 years teaching younger priestesses, 30 years of virginity, 30 years without marriage, without children, without the normal trajectory of Roman womanhood. But in exchange, she received something no other Roman woman could have. A Vestal could own property in her own name, make her own will without male permission. These seem small until you understand that every other Roman woman, regardless of wealth or patrician blood, needed a male guardian to conduct legal business. A senator's wife couldn't sell property without her husband's or father's or brother's consent. A Vestal could buy and sell at will. Vestals had sacrosanctus, the same legal protection as tribunes of the people. Assault a Vestal, and you faced death. When a Vestal traveled Rome's streets, she was preceded by a lictor, the same official who walked before magistrates, clearing the way. If a Vestal accidentally encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, that criminal was immediately freed. She didn't have to speak or gesture. Her mere presence was enough to overturn a death sentence. Vestals had the best seats at all public entertainments. They could give testimony in court without taking an oath. Their word was assumed truthful. They stored wills and important documents, including the wills of emperors. They witnessed treaties. They became political players, using their neutral status to mediate between factions, to plead for mercy, to carry messages between enemies who trusted no one else. In 143 BC, a Vestal named Claudia did something unprecedented. Her brother, Appius Claudius Pulcher, had been denied a triumph by the Senate. He decided to celebrate one anyway. A tribune tried to physically stop the triumphal chariot. Claudia threw herself onto it, using her sacrosanct status as a shield. The tribune couldn't touch her without committing a capital crime. The triumph proceeded. This was power real, tangible political power wielded by a woman in a society that gave women almost no power at all. So why does all this matter? Because you need to understand what a Vestal was before you can understand what happened when they fell. They weren't powerless victims. They were among the most privileged people in Rome. And that makes what happened to Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia even more revealing about how Roman society actually worked. The vow was simple: absolute chastity for 30 years. The penalty for breaking it was death, but not just any death. Romans believed that spilling a Vestal's blood would pollute the city, so they developed a punishment that technically didn't kill her. They buried her alive. The process was described in detail by Plutarch, writing centuries later, but drawing on older sources. When a Vestal was convicted of incest and breaking her vow, she would be dressed in burial clothes and placed on a covered litter like a corpse. The litter would be carried through the forum in complete silence. People would part without speaking. The Vestal inside couldn't see out. She could only hear footsteps, the terrible absence of sound. The litter would be carried to a place near the Porta Collina, where a small underground chamber had been prepared. Inside were placed a bed, a lamp with oil, a loaf of bread, water, and milk. Enough, Plutarch notes, to absolve the Romans of the charge of starving a sacred person to death. The Vestal would be led down, the entrance would be sealed. Earth heaped over it until no trace remained, and then everyone would leave. The Romans could claim they hadn't killed her. They had simply placed her underground with provisions. What happened after was between her and the gods. If she was truly innocent, the gods would save her. If guilty, the gods would judge. This is what waited for Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia in 114 BC, but the trial of these three Vestals wasn't really about sex. It was about power, crisis, and scapegoating in a republic tearing itself apart. The year 114 BC was soaked in anxiety. Germanic wars going badly, rumors of legions destroyed. The social war, brewing Rome's Italian allies increasingly unhappy, increasingly dangerous, political factions at each other's throats. And then that lightning strike, that dead girl, and the haruspices declaring the Vestals must be examined. 3 Vestals were accused: Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia. The accusation came from a slave. Think about that. In Roman society, slaves couldn't normally testify against free persons, but in cases involving Vestals, normal rules were suspended. The pollution they supposedly caused was so dangerous that any evidence could be considered. The case went before the Pontifical College, the board of priests with jurisdiction over religious crimes. They investigated and reached a verdict: Aemilia guilty, Licinia and Marcia innocent. Aemilia was sentenced, and the sentence was carried out. She was buried alive, but the Roman people weren't satisfied. The crisis hadn't passed. The gods were still angry. Anyone could see that. 2 guilty Vestals were still walking free, still polluting the city. Popular pressure forced the Senate to act. They established a special court headed by Lucius Cassius Longinus to retry the case. This was extraordinary. The Pontifical College's jurisdiction was supposed to be absolute, but political necessity overrode religious authority. The special court reached a different verdict. All 3 were guilty. Licinia and Marcia were sentenced to burial. Their alleged lovers, Lucius Veturius and the Emily brothers, were beaten to death in the Forum. Here's what you need to understand. There's no good evidence any of these women or men were actually guilty. No witness saw them together. No one testified to specific acts. The evidence seems to have consisted of the fact that young men had visited the house of the Vestals, and that the Vestals had been seen talking with men at religious festivals. They were convicted of being friendly with men. of being young women who interacted with young men in the normal course of life in Rome. But Rome needed scapegoats. The gods needed appeasing. The people needed to feel something was being done about the crisis. And so 3 women who had dedicated their lives to serving Rome, who had extraordinary power and privilege, were put to death for crimes they very probably didn't commit. This is the dark heart of the Vestal system. The same privilege that gave them power also made them perfect sacrifices when things went wrong. They were separate from normal society, liminal, ambiguous, neither men nor women, neither children nor mothers. When Rome needed someone to blame, someone whose death would mean something, Vestals were available, and it happened again and again. In 216 BC, after the catastrophic defeat at Cannae during the Second Punic War, 2 Vestals were convicted. One committed suicide, the other was buried alive. In 73 BC, a Vestal named Fabia was tried for incestum. She was acquitted, but only after a traumatic trial that destroyed her reputation. In 90 AD, the Emperor Domitian became obsessed with restoring traditional morality. He targeted the Vestals. Cornelia, the Virgo Maxima, chief of the order, was accused and buried alive without even a trial. 3 others were convicted and allowed to choose their method of suicide. Notice the pattern. These trials cluster around moments of crisis, military defeat, political upheaval, imperial transitions. Whenever Rome felt threatened, whenever the old order seemed to crumble, Vestals were put on trial. The historian Holt Parker has argued that Vestals functioned as pharmakoi ritual scapegoats. Their deaths were meant to purify Rome, to restore peace with the gods. Their guilt or innocence was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that they were ritually pure, set apart, and therefore effective sacrifices. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. All those privileges I described, the legal rights, the political power, the wealth, the honor made Vestals even more effective as scapegoats. The higher they stood, the more their fall meant. When an ordinary woman died, it registered as tragedy for her family. But when a Vestal died, a woman who had been set apart as sacred, who had power other women couldn't dream of, her death carried weight. It was a real sacrifice, giving up something genuinely valuable. The system created women with unprecedented privilege specifically so that privilege could be taken away when Rome needed a spectacle of punishment. Let me tell you about what happened to the women who survived their service, because not every Vestal was executed. Most served their 30 years and retired to private life. And what happened to them reveals another layer of complexity. After 30 years, a Vestal was free. She could leave the house of the Vestals, she could marry, she could finally live the life that other Roman women had lived decades earlier, but very few did. We have records of retired Vestals, some married, though they were typically in their late 30s or early 40s by then, past the normal marriage age for Roman women. Most didn't marry. They lived out their lives on the wealth they'd accumulated as independent women in a society that had no real category for independent women. Some continued to live near the house of the Vestals, maintaining informal connections to the order. Some became patrons, using their wealth to support younger priestesses or fund public works. We have inscriptions honoring these women, thanking them for their service, recording their donations. But you can hear the ambiguity in these inscriptions, the awkwardness of a society trying to categorize women who no longer fit any normal role. They're honored, but the honors sound almost apologetic. They're free, but freedom at 40, after 30 years of restriction, isn't the same as freedom at 20. There's a Vestal named Unia Torquata whose story breaks my heart. She served from around 30 AD to 60 AD through the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and into Nero's principate. She witnessed the madness of Caligula, the calculated cruelty of Nero. She kept the sacred fire burning while the world descended into chaos. She completed her service. She was free. And then we find inscriptions erected by family members' nephews and great-nephews. She'd never really known grateful for the honor she'd brought the family, but treating her as a curiosity, a relic, a woman outside normal categories. She never married. She lived another 20 years and was buried with honors, her tomb marked as that of a former Vestal. Even in death, that was her primary identity. Not daughter, not sister, not wife or mother. Vestal. So, what are we to make of this system? Was it oppressive? Absolutely. Women taken as children, stripped of normal life, forced into permanent virginity under threat of death, occasionally used as human sacrifices. Was it empowering? Also yes. Vestals had legal and political rights unprecedented for Roman women. They wielded genuine influence. They shaped policy. Some clearly found meaning in their service. Both are true, and that should make us deeply uncomfortable. We want clear narratives: oppressor and oppressed, powerful and powerless. But the Vestal system refuses to fit. It created a space where women could have power, but only by giving up what Roman society considered essential to womanhood: marriage, children, family. It honored them as sacred, but that sacred status made them available for sacrifice. It freed them from male control, but only by binding them to religious duties so strict that one mistake could mean death. The Vestal system thrived on contradiction. Romans showcased the Vestals as proof that women could hold power. Yet that power was granted only by removing them from ordinary womanhood. They had rights precisely because they occupied a liminal, controlled space, respected, yet tightly contained. Their existence reinforced patriarchy by declaring that women could wield influence only if they surrendered marriage, family, sexuality, and autonomy, and accepted death for disobedience. When Theodosius disbanded the order in 394 AD, the sacred flame died and Rome continued unchanged, exposing the myth that had shaped countless lives. Today, the House of the Vestals stands in silent witness to women who were privileged and vulnerable at once, a contradiction that reveals enduring truths about gender, power, and the constraints societies impose.